How do you arrest a gangster when the person you're looking for no longer exists? This isn't a question born from a simple misstep or a failure in paperwork. It's a profound mystery that left investigators grappling with a disturbing reality. The suspect's identity, once solid on paper, dissolved into nothing under scrutiny. The name was real enough, documented in official records, complete with valid documents and legitimate addresses. Yet, when officers tried to trace the person behind those credentials, they found only shadows and dead ends. No trace of a living, breathing individual matched the profile. It was as if the suspect had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a fabricated shell that existed solely in bureaucratic systems. The confusion was palpable. Law enforcement had a clear lead, a name tied to a high-profile robbery, yet that lead evaporated the moment they dug deeper. The usual avenues, background checks, surveillance footage, witness testimonies, offered no confirmation of the suspect's existence beyond the paperwork. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or a clever alias. It was something far more unsettling. The suspect's disappearance was not an accident or an anomaly, but a calculated move. The gangster had engineered his own erasure, turning the investigation into a pursuit of a ghost. Detectives involved in the case exchanged uneasy glances as they pieced together this puzzle. The usual tactics for tracking a criminal, the digital footprints, social connections, financial transactions, were conspicuously absent. Every thread they followed unraveled, leading nowhere. The carefully constructed identity appeared as a flawless facade, designed to confound and mislead. It was clear that the disappearance was part of a larger strategy, an intentional blank slate created long before the crime was committed. This story is not about the violent drama often associated with such crimes or the spectacle that follows a brazen heist. Instead, it pivots to a chilling examination of how anonymity can be deliberately created and weaponized. The gangster's true crime lay not just in the robbery itself, but in erasing himself from the system the moment the deed was done. Investigators were left not chasing a man, but a meticulously erased identity, a phantom engineered to exist only on paper. The implications of this approach challenge conventional law enforcement methods and reveal a new frontier where the greatest weapon is not firepower or intimidation, but invisibility itself. As we delve deeper into this case, it becomes clear that the key to understanding these crimes lies in the complex web of false identities and carefully constructed disappearances. Each name, each document, serves as a thread in a larger tapestry designed to mislead and confound. Tracking such figures requires more than traditional detective work. It demands a patient unraveling of layers intentionally woven to obscure any trace. If you follow these explorations, you will encounter more stories where robbers don masks not just metaphorically, but legally manufacturing personas that vanish as quickly as the crimes themselves. These cases offer a unique window into the evolving tactics criminals employ to slip through the cracks of the system, challenging investigators to adapt their methods and rethink what it means to pursue justice. In this narrative, every detail matters, from the seemingly insignificant ledger entry to the overlooked surveillance footage, and piecing them together reveals the contours of a shadow world operating just beyond reach. As we continue, we will examine how law enforcement agencies confront these elusive threats and the strategies developed to pierce the veil of anonymity. Understanding these patterns is essential, not only to follow one case but to comprehend a broader phenomenon reshaping the landscape of crime. The pursuit is as much about insight as it is about evidence, requiring a careful balance of skepticism and persistence. Stay with us as we trace the steps behind the erasure, uncovering how a man becomes a ghost and what it takes to bring such phantoms back into the light. In the shadowy world where these criminals operate, invisibility is not merely a tactic. It is the foundation of survival. Professional gangsters do not rely on brute force or notoriety. Instead, they construct elaborate systems of compartmentalization designed to sever any direct link between themselves and their crimes. Each participant functions within narrowly defined, temporary roles, often unaware of the full scope of the operation. This fragmentation ensures that if one piece is uncovered, it doesn't unravel the entire network. The deliberate absence of enduring relationships or permanent identities acts like a firewall against law enforcement infiltration. From the moment a plan is conceived, Every element is calibrated to minimize exposure. Names are rarely exchanged beyond what is immediately necessary, and even those are often aliases. Communication is fleeting and coded, relying on short-lived contacts who vanish as quickly as they appear. These disposable connections prevent any lasting trail that could be traced back to the principal actors. It is common for these criminals to adopt multiple identities, none of which persist long enough to be linked conclusively to their real selves or to each other. This practice thwarts traditional investigative methods that depend on patterns of association and known affiliations. Silence, above all, is the currency of this underground economy. The Code of Omerta, a vow of silence, is not romanticized here but understood as a practical necessity. Any breach could expose not just an individual but the entire operation. The absence of chatter and the refusal to cooperate with authorities create a vacuum of information, leaving law enforcement grasping at fragments rather than coherent narratives. Even among themselves, participants reveal only what is necessary and nothing more, avoiding any unnecessary conversation about past or future plans. This environment breeds a constant state of impermanence. Assignments are short-term, often lasting only as long as the heist itself. After the job, the operative disappears, sometimes literally, into a new persona, a different neighborhood, or a fresh network of contacts. Returning to familiar haunts or maintaining old relationships is too risky. Every known connection is a potential vulnerability. The transient nature of their existence means that their footprints are shallow and easily obscured. Robberies carried out under these conditions are meticulously planned to avoid leaving physical evidence. Vehicles used are often stolen or rented under false names, and cash is laundered through multiple intermediaries before reaching its final destination. Surveillance is countered by rotating lookouts and decoys, all coordinated through brief, encrypted exchanges. The very structure of their operations is designed to keep investigators several steps behind, reducing the chance that any one individual can be identified or apprehended based on the aftermath. The necessity of disappearing after a robbery is not accidental but a calculated expectation. It is ingrained in the mindset of these criminals that remaining visible, or maintaining any form of ongoing presence, is tantamount to signing a death warrant. To be caught is not simply a failure. It is the end of the line. In this subculture, anonymity is the only true asset, and constant reinvention is the price paid for continued freedom. This relentless cycle of appearing and vanishing creates the perfect conditions for criminal activity to flourish unseen, as if the perpetrators were ghosts slipping through the cracks of the city's underbelly. From the outset, the gangster operated less like a figure of brute force and more like a strategist shaping his existence around impermanence. Unlike the caricature of a violent outlaw, his professionalism was defined by meticulous control over the smallest details, especially those concerning his identity. For him, identity was not a birthright. It was a tool, a malleable construct to be adjusted and discarded as circumstances demanded. Permanence was a liability, a tether that could be pulled to expose him. Thus, he avoided everything that could anchor him. No long-term leases, no official documentation tying him to a single place, no steady jobs that would leave a paper trail. His past addresses read like a map of transience. Temporary stays in nondescript motels, brief sublet agreements, and even shorter stints in shared apartments where no one ever bothered to ask questions. Each location was chosen for its anonymity, for the ease with which he could erase himself once the time came. Mail was forwarded, phones were burner devices swapped frequently, and digital footprints were minimized or cleverly obfuscated. This wasn't the result of panic or fear. It was a calculated strategy born from understanding that permanence equated to vulnerability. Employment, too, was a series of fleeting engagements. He never settled into a role that demanded continuity or produced records that could be traced. Instead, his work history was a patchwork of odd jobs, short-term contracts, or freelance gigs that required skill but little personal exposure. Each position was a temporary mask, a role played and then discarded without leaving behind more than the faintest shadow. He knew that a stable job created a paper trail, and in his world, paper trails were the first step toward capture. Names were no exception to this fluidity. He used many, each chosen for its convenience and lack of connection to previous lives. These names were not tied to any emotional resonance or personal history. They were simply identifiers, tools to navigate bureaucratic systems or social interactions without ever revealing the man beneath. Like a craftsman selecting the right instrument for a job, he rotated through aliases with precision, ensuring none could be linked back to a permanent self. This chameleon-like approach extended to his appearance and mannerisms, which shifted subtly enough to avoid recognition but consistently enough to maintain the illusion of authenticity. Disappearing was not an act of desperation but a deliberate lifestyle choice long before any high-stakes robbery or criminal endeavor. It was a continuous practice, a way of living that required discipline and foresight. This pattern of vanishing and reappearing was ingrained, a natural rhythm that allowed him to operate in the shadows without drawing attention. The ability to dissolve into the city's fabric and become invisible was his greatest skill, one honed over years of deliberate effort. In this world, permanence was the enemy of freedom. Every fixed point increased the risk of exposure. Every stable connection was a potential weakness. By consciously rejecting these, he maintained a kind of professional detachment, treating his own existence as a series of transactions rather than a narrative. No emotional ties, no personal attachments, just the calculated use of identity as a means to an end. This was the essence of his professionalism. Mastery over disappearance, an art form perfected before the stakes ever escalated beyond the invisible games he had always played. The false identity crafted for the robbery was a precise instrument, designed not for permanence but for immediate functionality. Every detail was meticulously assembled to provide just enough legitimacy to navigate the necessary environments. Renting a safe place to lay low, securing access to restricted areas, and moving without raising suspicion. It was never intended to withstand scrutiny beyond the brief window of the operation. Its strength lay in its very fragility. At its core, the identity comprised a fabricated name, a plausible background, and a set of documents engineered to pass routine checks. The name was common enough to avoid drawing attention but unique enough to prevent easy cross-referencing with existing records. The fabricated history was deliberately sparse, minimal employment details, no deep roots or connections. This thin veneer of plausibility allowed for swift verification without leaving a trail that could be traced back or followed up. The identification cards, rental agreements, and even a temporary bank account were all forged with an understanding of their limited lifespan. Each document bore subtle imperfections, just enough to fool casual examination but too flawed for long-term use. This constructed persona was deployed with surgical precision. It provided the necessary credentials to rent a modest apartment near the target, a place to disappear into the city's shadows without inviting curiosity. The false identity enabled the opening of accounts and the acquisition of tools critical to the heist, all while maintaining a buffer between the operator and his true self. The identity acted as a mask, a vessel that bore the weight of the illicit activities, shielding the real individual from exposure. Yet, this identity was inherently disposable. It was never meant to be a new life or an alternate reality. This brevity was a feature, not a flaw. The entire purpose was to facilitate the robbery and then be cast aside, discarded like a worn glove once the job was done. There was no emotional investment, no desire to nurture this fabricated existence. The moment the operation concluded, the false identity would vanish, erased from records, abandoned physically and mentally severed. This intentional fragility ensured that even if the identity were compromised, it would yield no valuable information. It was a calculated risk, a gamble that the minimal footprint would outpace any investigation. The absence of connections or detailed background meant there was nothing for authorities or adversaries to latch onto. It was a ghost, present just long enough to complete its task before dissolving into nothingness. The construction of this identity exemplified the operator's philosophy. Identity was a tool, not a treasure. It was a temporary disguise, a calculated fiction crafted for survival during the critical phase of the crime. By embracing the impermanence of this persona, he maintained the professional detachment that had always defined him. In the world of shadow crimes, where disappearance was mastery, the false identity was the ultimate expression of control. A fleeting shadow, perfectly formed to vanish at the moment of necessity. From the outset, The orchestration prioritized the event that would follow the initial act rather than the act itself. More than the theft, it was the disappearance that demanded meticulous attention, for it was in vanishing that true mastery was revealed. The crime was not about seizing wealth or valuables, but about dissolving into the void without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions and silence. Every element of the operation was designed to ensure that no thread could be pulled, no pattern discerned, and no connection drawn. The essence lay in crafting an absence so complete that the world might forget the presence ever existed. Targets were selected with a precision born from patience and observation. Predictability was the guiding principle. Individuals whose routines followed unvarying rhythms, whose habits left little room for surprise. These were not high-profile marks, nor individuals entangled in complex networks, but those whose movements were as consistent as clockwork, their interactions minimal and transactional. The choice was deliberate, engagements that could be rehearsed in the mind and anticipated with certainty, reducing the need for impulsive decisions or unpredictable variables. This predictability was not exploited for profit but harnessed to preserve anonymity, ensuring that no unexpected encounter could unravel the carefully woven fabric of the plan. Timing was a silent partner throughout, dictating the tempo with a steady, unhurried beat. There was no rush, no frenzy to hasten the process. Instead, patience permeated each phase, allowing for moments of observation, recalibration, and quiet confidence. Restraint was exercised rigorously, with no step taken without full consideration of its potential consequences. The absence of haste meant that every move was deliberate and measured, designed not to maximize gain but to minimize exposure. This discipline transformed the operation into an exercise in control, where impulse was subdued in favor of calculated equilibrium. The focus on disappearance extended beyond physical movements to the very concept of identity. The false persona was a tool for erasure, a mask worn only long enough to blur the edges of reality before dissolving completely. It was not a guise for deception aimed at profit, but a buffer to protect the self from recognition. In this way, the planning transcended ordinary criminal ambition. It was an endeavor to become nothing, to collapse into the shadows so seamlessly that pursuit became futile. The goal was not accumulation but obliteration of presence, of trace, of vulnerability. Every precaution was taken to ensure that the aftermath would be as unremarkable as the act itself was precise. The operation avoided unnecessary interactions or deviations that might invite scrutiny. It was the absence of drama, the lack of spectacle, that shielded the operation from attention. In a world where chaos often leaves a trail, this carefully calibrated stillness was the true safeguard. The disappearance was a performance in invisibility, a testament to the power of absence over possession. Ultimately, the planning revealed a mindset attuned to survival through invisibility rather than conquest through acquisition. Profit was a secondary consideration, often negligible in the shadow play of evasion. The art lay in leaving no footprints, in becoming a ghost whose story ended before it was noticed. This was not a tale of gain, but of loss, a deliberate, controlled loss of self into the void, where anonymity was the only prize worth seeking. The operation unfolded with meticulous precision, unfolding in a manner that was almost antiseptic in its execution. There were no raised voices, no hurried footsteps echoing through hallways, and no sudden movements to disturb the stillness of the environment. Every action was deliberate yet understated, carried out with an efficiency that left no room for error or deviation. The participants moved in a coordinated sequence, each step measured and timed to avoid attracting attention. Entry was gained through a point of access that had been monitored and assessed well in advance. The lock mechanism yielded silently, manipulated with tools that bore no trace of the operator's touch beyond the immediate moment. No alarms sounded, no sensors were tripped. The space was navigated in near darkness, with only the faintest glimmers of light guiding the way, ensuring that nothing was disturbed or displaced. Surfaces remained untouched except where absolutely necessary, and even then, contact was minimized to prevent any inadvertent transfer of material evidence. The items targeted were approached not with haste but with clinical detachment. There was no rummaging through belongings, no scanning for valuables beyond the predetermined objective. The removal was confined strictly to what had been identified beforehand, and nothing extraneous was taken or altered. The objects were handled carefully, avoiding fingerprints or marks, and placed into containers designed to absorb sound and prevent any inadvertent noise. Throughout the process, there was an absence of emotional response. No expressions of satisfaction or frustration crossed the faces of those involved. Their demeanor remained neutral and composed, as if the act itself were a routine procedure rather than a transgression. This emotional neutrality extended to the environment as well. No disruptions were caused to furniture, no doors were left ajar, and no items were displaced beyond what was necessary. The scene was left as it had been found, save for the deliberate absence of the targeted possessions. Communication was minimal and reserved for essential coordination. Instructions were exchanged in whispers or brief gestures, avoiding any verbal exchanges that might be overheard or recorded. The rhythm of the operation was steady and unhurried, rejecting the frenetic energy commonly associated with such events. Time was managed with precision, neither rushed nor prolonged, ensuring completion within a window that allowed for a seamless exit. Exit strategies were executed with the same care as entry. No trace was left behind to suggest the path taken or the identity of those involved. Surveillance cameras, where present, were avoided or bypassed through calculated positioning and timing. Footprints were non-existent, as the movement avoided surfaces that would capture such evidence. No personal items or distinguishing marks were left in the vicinity. The environment remained undisturbed, preserving its original state to the greatest extent possible. The aftermath offered no clues, no signatures or tokens left behind to hint at the perpetrator's identity or motives. It was a disappearance rather than a presence, a void where evidence might have been expected. The deliberate absence of chaos or drama rendered the event almost invisible to casual observers, a quiet subtraction from the fabric of the place rather than an intrusion. This approach ensured that the incident would remain inscrutable, eluding connection to any individual or group. In essence, the robbery was not an act of overt confrontation or spectacle but a study in controlled absence. It was a deliberate erasure, a removal that respected the boundaries of invisibility and anonymity. The event left behind not a story to be told, but a silence to be deciphered, a scenario where what did not happen was as telling as what did. Through restraint and precision, it affirmed the philosophy that the ultimate success lay not in acquisition, but in the careful preservation of oblivion. The moments following the robbery did not unfold with any theatrical display or frantic dash into the night. There was no high-speed chase, no sudden upheaval of lifestyle marked by conspicuous spending or reckless behavior. Instead, what happened was an intentional withdrawal from all the usual markers of identity. A quiet, deliberate vanishing act that left behind nothing but a void where a name once stood. The identity that had carried the individual through days, interactions, and transactions simply ceased to exist in any tangible form. No calls were made, no new accounts were opened, no social media profiles were updated. The persona was effectively erased from the public sphere, slipping into the shadows not through escape, but through absence. This disappearance was not a frantic attempt to outrun the past but a calculated retreat into invisibility. Unlike the cinematic portrayals of criminals who flee the scene with blaring sirens and flashing lights, this method relied on the power of stillness and silence. By breaking all ties to the stolen identity and refusing to engage with any systems that require proof of existence, the individual avoided the typical pitfalls of exposure. The key was not to run but to become untraceable, to inhabit the cracks of society where records don't reach and eyes do not peer. It was an erasure so complete that even the most persistent investigators would find themselves chasing a ghost. The effectiveness of disappearing quietly lies in its subtlety. A dramatic escape, while gripping, often leaves a trail. Hurried decisions, desperate moves, and patterns that can be analyzed and followed. In contrast, vanishing without a trace confounds expectations and shatters assumptions. When someone simply stops using an identity, they remove themselves from all the digital and physical networks that define presence. There are no transactions to flag, no sightings to report, no habitual behaviors to analyze. This absence becomes a kind of camouflage, a blank space on the map of human activity. Moreover, a quiet disappearance minimizes risk. The less one interacts with institutions, banks, government agencies, communication networks, the lower the chance of detection. It's a strategic use of invisibility, turning the tools designed to track and identify into dead ends. Through this approach, the individual diminishes their footprint to near zero, making it exponentially harder for law enforcement or rival entities to pinpoint their location or intentions. It's a game played in reverse, where the goal is not to be seen but to be forgotten, and success is measured by the enduring silence that follows. This calculated vanishing is not just about self-preservation. It's a statement about control over one's narrative. By refusing to participate in the systems that demand identity, the individual asserts a form of autonomy rarely achieved in a world obsessed with visibility and data. The disappearance becomes a powerful act of resistance against surveillance and the relentless documentation of lives. It turns the absence into a presence of its own, a void that speaks volumes precisely because it is devoid of information. For those intrigued by the shadowy art of disappearing and the intricate methods gangsters and robbers employ to vanish without a trace, there are countless stories where identity itself is the ultimate weapon and refuge. Exploring these tales offers insight into how anonymity can be wielded not as weakness but as strength, how silence can be as telling as noise. If you find yourself drawn to uncovering the hidden layers of such disappearances and the delicate balance between presence and oblivion, consider following along. There's much more to discover about the lives that slip between the cracks, where nothing is as it seems, and the greatest mysteries are the ones that leave no trace at all. Authorities approached the investigation with the tools and protocols long established for cases involving missing persons or suspected fraud. Their initial steps were methodical, verifying the identity of the individual through official documentation, tracing residential addresses, and cross-referencing records with various government databases. Each document, birth certificates, social security numbers, utility bills, and employment records, appeared authentic at first glance. They bore official seals, correct formats, and timestamps consistent with standard bureaucratic processes. Yet, as investigators delved deeper, these seemingly legitimate elements failed to converge into a coherent, tangible reality. The addresses linked to the individual were real locations on official registries, often residential buildings or office complexes that did exist physically. However, visits to these sites yielded no sign of the person in question. Neighbors and occupants confirmed that no one by that name had ever lived or worked there. In some cases, the addresses were assigned to properties that had changed hands multiple times, complicating the trail. Other times, the listed addresses corresponded to vacant lots or buildings scheduled for demolition, suggesting that the information was either outdated or deliberately misleading. This discrepancy between documented residence and actual occupancy highlighted the system's inherent reliance on static datasets that may not reflect real-time realities. Records from employment agencies and financial institutions also painted a picture of legitimacy. Payroll stubs, bank statements, and tax filings indicated economic activity consistent with a functioning individual. Yet, banks reported no transactions beyond routine automated deposits, and employers could not substantiate the presence of the person on their payroll beyond digital entries. This pattern extended to social services and educational institutions, where enrollment and benefit records existed but were not supported by physical attendance or participation. The documentation was undeniably present, but the tangible proof of personhood remained elusive. Investigators recognized that the fragmentation and compartmentalization of data across multiple agencies and private entities created gaps and overlaps that could be exploited. The system was designed to verify identities through cross-checking existing records, assuming that discrepancies would raise flags. However, when falsified or synthetic identities were inserted carefully, each individual element passed scrutiny in isolation. The lack of integrated, real-time verification mechanisms meant that a composite identity, assembled from disparate but individually valid components, could persist undetected. The investigation revealed that this case was not an anomaly born from negligence, but rather a consequence of a system operating precisely as intended. Every agency involved followed established procedures, verifying documents against their own databases and reporting findings accurately. The failure was systemic, rooted in the very architecture of identity management and record-keeping, a system optimized for efficiency and compartmentalized verification rather than comprehensive, holistic validation. This realization shifted the investigative focus. Rather than faulting law enforcement or administrative bodies, attention turned to the structural limitations inherent in bureaucratic processes. The case illuminated how the reliance on paper trails and digital footprints, without a mechanism to confirm the existence of the person behind them, could be manipulated to create convincing but ultimately empty identities. The system's design, emphasizing procedural correctness over substantive verification, allowed for a shadow existence, one that could evade detection not because of oversight but because the protocols themselves did not account for such deception. In the end, the search for this non-existent individual underscored the paradox of modern identity verification. The more seamless and integrated the paperwork appeared, the more opaque the truth became. The investigation, thorough and diligent, exposed the limits of institutional frameworks and highlighted the urgent need for adaptive strategies that could penetrate beyond documents and data points to the human reality they were meant to represent. The night had settled into an uneasy quiet when the small inconsistency first revealed itself, not through a blaring alarm or a glaring error, but in a barely noticeable detail buried deep within the layers of forged documentation. A single line in a financial record, linked to a shadow account that had been meticulously scrubbed of any traceable origin, contained a timestamp that didn't quite match the rest. It was a fraction of a second off, an anomaly so slight that it would have slipped past any cursory check. Yet for those trained to spot the faintest tremors beneath a surface of calm, it was enough to ignite a flicker of doubt. The gangster had always been a master of disguise, not just physically but administratively. Every alias, every forged identity was crafted with an obsessive precision born from years of evading detection. Yet, this minute discrepancy, a single transaction timestamp recorded in Greenwich Mean Time rather than the local zone, hinted at a careless oversight. It suggested a moment when the man behind the mask had accessed the system from a location incongruent with his supposed whereabouts. Perhaps a brief lapse during a transfer between devices, or a hurried attempt to mask the trail that instead left a thread exposed. No one else noticed it at first. The anomaly was buried in digital noise, drowned among countless data points that, on their own, meant nothing. But the investigator who stumbled upon it felt a shiver of unease. It wasn't proof of anything concrete, certainly not enough to unravel the entire web. Yet it was a crack in the armor, a reminder that even the most elaborate facades are vulnerable to the smallest human errors. The gangster's identity remained intact, but the invisible tether to a real place, somewhere real, somewhere tangible, had momentarily surfaced. This near exposure didn't lead to frantic calls or immediate raids. Instead, it was filed away in a quiet report, a footnote in an otherwise airtight dossier. But the tension it introduced was palpable. In a world where every detail had been accounted for, this tiny mistake suggested the presence of a fragile human element beneath the cold mechanics of criminal enterprise. It was a fleeting whisper of imperfection in an otherwise flawless operation. The gangster himself remained oblivious to the slip. His routine was unchanged, his movements seamless. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, a faint shadow of vulnerability now lingered, though he neither acknowledged nor fully understood it. The mistake was like a scratch on a polished surface, too subtle to mar the overall image but significant enough to disturb the equilibrium beneath. It was proof that no matter how carefully a plan is constructed, the unpredictability of human nature can introduce flaws impossible to fully eliminate. The shadow identity, once thought unassailable, suddenly seemed less like a permanent fortress and more like a delicate choreography of chance and control. Every forged document, every false lead, every fabricated alibi balanced precariously on the edge of exposure. In the end, the near error was a silent testament to the fragility of even the most consummate deception. It neither confirmed nor denied the gangster's true identity, but it revealed just how close the veil had come to lifting. And while the investigation pressed onward, chasing shadows and echoes, that one tiny inconsistency remained a quiet, unresolved riddle. An open door never fully closed, a secret almost told. What makes this case truly extraordinary is not the audacity of the theft itself, but the meticulous disappearance that followed. The perfect crime was never the robbery. It was the vanishing act that erased the gangster from every conceivable trace. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no digital trails. Only silence and absence filled the void he left behind. While the stolen goods carried tangible value, they were ultimately irrelevant compared to the intangible asset the fugitive secured: invisibility. The investigation, painstaking and exhaustive, unfolded like a chess match played against a ghost. Every lead that seemed promising dissolved into nothingness. Every informant turned cold. Every surveillance camera revealed only a blurred enigma. The gangster didn't merely slip away. He dissolved into the fabric of the city, becoming a phantom beyond reach or recognition. The near error uncovered, a seemingly insignificant inconsistency, served less as a clue and more as a stark reminder of how close this shadow had come to being unmasked, yet how expertly he maintained his guise. No arrest was made, no confession extracted, no final confrontation staged. The absence of a suspect became the decisive factor in his success. In this case, the law enforcement agencies found themselves hunting a ghost, while the real victory lay in the gangster's ability to leave behind nothing that could be seized, nothing that could be proven. The disappearance was the ultimate defiance, a cold, calculated act of erasure that rendered the entire operation untouchable. This unresolved riddle lingers still, a silent testament to the limits of detection and the art of vanishing. Such mastery over identity and presence challenges the very foundations of justice, blurring the line between pursuit and surrender. As the investigation fades into shadow, it leaves behind a chilling question. How many others have perfected this disappearance, slipping through the cracks with nothing more than a whispered name? To uncover the stories of those who didn't just commit crimes but erased themselves afterward, join us in the next Shadow Crimes episode. Prepare to delve into a realm where identity is fluid, and the most dangerous criminals are those who vanish as completely as the crimes they commit.